So, Lindsay, this is Molly again. It is 1 o'clock. I'm just checking with both you and Anya. I believe we are now at quorum. Is that correct?
Sorry, I'm learning about muting thing. I think we have the majority of folks, and I don't know if we really need a quorum since we don't typically vote.
Okay. So I think at 1:01, I think I'll go ahead and get started. We will kind of as other members join. First and foremost, welcome everyone to our Juvenile Justice Committee meeting today. We have a really packed agenda, and I will look forward to meeting everybody in person at some point in the future and having as many people available as possible. But today we're virtually. So after introductions this afternoon, we'll try to stay on task today. And going from kind of one topic to the next. Hopefully, as we have our conversations today, it spurs questions, it spurs comments, and we're going to ask for those to make sure that those are brought back to the Juvenile Justice Committee, and if we have time at the end, we'll incorporate them today. But we will want to make sure that everyone does have the opportunity to weigh in and communicate with Anya after the meeting if there's something that we aren't able to get to during the meeting. Anya, are there any other housekeeping things that I need to be able to make sure we cover before we get started today?
No, I think you did a pretty good job covering them all. Thank you.
Okay. So what I'm going to ask, Lindsay, is I'm going to ask that you do a roll call of the committee members. GoToMeeting doesn't have the capacity to raise the hand. I was trying to figure that piece out a little while ago. Committee members, please. If there's a question you have on any of the presentations today, or if it's going on that we haven't taken the time, please add to the chat box that you have a question, and I'll make sure to get to all of the committee members. Again, want to have as full participation as possible, and at the end, we'll try to open it up to the floor or communicate with Anya following. So with that, Lindsay, would you like to do our roll call?
Sure, I've never done it before, so I guess I'll just read down the side here of the agenda.
So maybe Anya, you know who is on the subcommittee. Do you want to do it for us then?
There's a lot of noise. Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Jjdpa. Oh, there she is waving. Sorry, I'm excellent. Parasa Chinrami.
Hi, I'm here.
Hi, Issa Tuberi. Tabitha Lewis.
Here.
I thought I saw you. Christina Parkman will be joining us a little later. Molly Rogers.
Here.
John Teague.
Right here, thank you.
Hi. And Sam Ko.
And he's put it in the chat box.
Okay, excellent. I think
Perfect.
that's all committee members.
Thank you so much. I would also just like to take a moment and thank Director Brian Detman for joining us today. I'm really glad you were able to participate with us.
Hello, welcome everybody. Excited to be here.
Great. With that, Sonji, I'm going to turn it over and have our topic of racial and ethnic disparities in our training.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you all. I hope that each of you are doing and feeling well, staying safe, staying sane in the midst of a very roller coaster year. I will be discussing one point of work that is very closely related to racial and ethnic disparities. As many of you know, we participate in the Coalition of Juvenile Justice, which is a national organization of stakeholders within juvenile justice, including SAG members, workers like myself, nonprofits who join forces to try to make a difference with juvenile justice policy and other aspects of juvenile justice work. And so their annual conference is coming up virtually the third week of November. And Molly, I believe, will be representing the Youth Development Council as a state advisory group member. And in that role, she will have the opportunity to make votes on behalf of YDC. And one of those votes will be about being an express supporter of this equity statement and platform that I'm about to share with you all. That's partially on the screen now. As you can see now, this is 10 pages. So we're going to go through it as smoothly as I hope will happen. But this is very much a working, living document, and the things that you see underlined are things that are being edited real time. The last time I believe work was done on this document was not this past Friday, a week ago Friday, with the racial and ethnic disparities coordinators group across the country. And this was the second opportunity that we had to look at this document. And I believe it had went to a committee of state advisory group members for their feedback as well. We will convene again to make more edits and get closer to a final draft on November 6th. And so when the vote happens, Molly will be representing you all, and we wanted you to have a first glimpse. And when the final document, the one that will be voted on, is complete, I will make sure that you all have a copy of that so that you can see any changes and make sure that you're still in agreement with that. If you can excuse me for 1 second.
This is Molly. While Sonji's taking a moment, I just want to remind everybody and let everybody know that we are recording our meeting today, and so that it can, just wanted to make sure everybody knew that. And Jamie, who sent a note in the chat box, I'm not sure, well, you wouldn't be able to hear me, so I'll respond to you directly. Sorry.
My apologies, I needed to cough and clear my throat. And so when the final document is prepared, I will make sure that you all get a copy of that, and any additional comments or just the final okay, so that we can have Molly express our support. And after, of course, we join with those across the country, other states. This will be one of the platforms that is our foundation for the work ahead for the upcoming year. And so in stating that we support it, we want to actually try to do some of the things that it says, right? So it will serve as one of the foundations for the work that we do with the juvenile crime prevention team, and then also specifically with my work with racial and ethnic disparities. And so I'm going to kind of give you the legend of how this document is presented to you. This is a draft. Again, most of the things that are underlined are still a work in progress, and this is just a very raw version. Lindsay, if you could scroll, I believe, to maybe page 3, that has a full purview of how the document works. Perfect. So I went through and color coded for you. Each letter, A, B, C, and D, is more like an objective, an overarching goal, and then there are Roman numerals between 1 and I believe maybe up to 6 or 7 that are sub goals and objectives. So B has a color coding, so any Roman numeral that you see highlighted in green will correlate with the objective of B. And so we're going to try to go through these as smoothly as possible. And as you will see, each overarching letter, which again is a objective, and the Roman numerals are the sub goals in order to achieve that objective, will be color coded together. Under those, you may see the whereas statements, which are resolutions that the drafter from CJJ is saying that, you know, whereas this exists, we have recognized that all of these things exist. And so because of that, we have a recommendation, which you will see under the last applicable whereas resolution for that specific sub goal. So all of them don't have everything, but this is a complete view of how the document is. The letter, again, is the overarching goal. The Roman numeral is the sub goal, and then the resolutions, which are things that have been found to be true, and the recommendation from CJJ with the support of all of the express signers. So Lindsay, if you can scroll back up to page 1. This pretext is something that I'm actually very proud of, because this is a direct thought that I thought should be added to the document, and thankfully and humbly, those on the call with me agreed that we make a firm stance on anti-racism and boldly address racism and anti-racism for any entity that interacts with youth of color, i.e. and others, and boldly denounce racism and anti-racism stance. Again, this is not going to be perfectly grammatically correct, because the person that was typing, Naomi, who is the executive director of CJJ, was doing this real time in a call, and then everybody had access. This was a Google Doc that everybody can go in and kind of make comments to. So the first main objective, A, is to reaffirm and strengthen the commitment to train those working with youth and families. And with that objective, 2 of the sub goals that we thought would be fitting would be to ensure that teachers, school administrators, and other youth serving professionals adequately understand young people and the impacts of racial bias on youth of color. The recommendation was that we recommend to provide federal funding to ensure that teachers, doctors, therapists, and others who come into contact with young people receive training on racial bias, cultural humility, culturally responsive mental health, culturally responsive adolescent brain development, so on and so forth, as you can see there. Lindsay, do you mind making it a little bit larger, zooming in a little bit more, please? The zoom at the very top there with the plus and minus, I believe. Right next to the hand, yes. Thank you. So the next, can you scroll down just a little bit to go to number 2, please? The next sub goal was to improve training for law enforcement on interacting with youth as means of eliminating racial and ethnic disparities. That recommendation was to provide federal funding to ensure that any law enforcement officer who comes in contact with young people is trained annually on racial bias, cultural humility, the same things from the first recommendation. And as you can see there, there was specific conversation about special needs and what that meant. And there was different perspectives on including the word autism, because you know that that comes with some character traits. And there have been instances where autistic young people have been thought to being defiant or disruptive in their interaction with law enforcement, which led to a negative outcome that may possibly could have been avoided if the officer was able to recognize that that was from the intellectual developmental disability that the young person had. And so specifically here, you also see training should be grounded in a place of peace instead of de-escalation and militarization. If you could please scroll down to the next page, Lindsay. The third overarching objective was to partner with diverse trainers, including young people and families of color. And this conversation was important, and there was some back and forth on this, but the core idea was that in order to understand the needs of young people of color, you need to have people who can relate to them and understand their journey and the lived experience of being a person of color, and also interacting and engaging with families of color. So that's what we kind of drafted after some back and forth dialogue. And that whereas statement is still being drafted. As you can see, it's incomplete. And the recommendation here is that's in progress is to provide financial incentives for trainings related to young people and families that are led by and in partnership with young people of color and their families. Lindsay, if you can scroll to the next page, please. So the next overarching objective, B, was to commit to ending the over-policing of youth of color. The first sub-goal was to prioritize alternatives to arrest and system involvement. I'm not going to read all of the whereas statements because you all know that these things exist. Whereas young people are often better served if involvement in the justice system can be avoided, whereas adolescent brain development, you know, one thing that Oregon was at the forefront of is acknowledging and really putting hardcore policy into place to say that, you know, the young adult brain doesn't stop forming until approximately 25 years old, and that people up until that age are still considered youth because of their brain development. So that corresponding language would be added, of course. So these resolutions are things that have been found to be true. If you could scroll down just a little bit more, Lindsay, to the recommendation. To provide financial incentives to states to incentivize diversion over arrest, and to ensure that clear diversion policies are put into place to limit the use of arrest and system involvement whenever possible, reinvest savings from decreased incarceration back into the communities, with a focus on ensuring that diversion programming is culturally competent and placed in the communities where data shows it is needed and is in line with the community's needs and strengths. And this statement that's underlined was still being edited. Directly resource financial incentives, mental health supports, early interventions for high needs, and how to keep out. So those are just kind of brainstorming thoughts. And please, 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 I'm asking you, if you see anything that you think you would like to see inserted, deleted, question about, please note it as I'm talking, and then when I get through the entire document, we can go back to that place. So if you can please reference maybe the page number at the top there, like for example, this is page 3 out of 10, and kind of some of the language that you saw that you would like to have a conversation about. Lindsay, if you can scroll to the next page, please. So this is still under B, and that is instill a commitment among law enforcement to racial equity. It's pretty straightforward. The recommendation is incentivizing hiring of officers that are committed to anti-racist policies, annually trained on implicit bias, and who look like the communities in which they are working, hire police sensitive to young people, work with prosecutors and attorneys general's offices to change hiring databases of bad actors on public record discretion. And we know that in some of the special session in Oregon, that was one thing that was on the policy decisions that the legislators made, was to create a database of those bad actors. And I believe this may have been added because I said that. So let's keep going. Due diligence, commitment to background checks, understanding history of racist or improper behavior, national standards around full and complete history of employment, complaints, etc. Basically, being able to weed out the bad apples, because we know that all law enforcement are not bad actors, and they don't contribute to the things that have oppressed people of color, but being able to keep track on those who do, so that they can't jump from agency to agency and law enforcement entity to law enforcement entity, because that has been known to happen. Please scroll to the next page, Lindsay. Thank you. Again, we're still under B. Ensure that law enforcement understand the long-term impacts of interactions they have with young people. To broaden the concept, the police first contact and find of introduction to the whole juvenile justice system. Not only may it be traumatic, shape the child and the community's understanding of the role of police, principles of fairness and equity. It's bigger than just the police officer and the police department, and helps to formulate perception and how you interact with police in the future. There are some grammatical errors there. And again, these are some statements that have been generally found to be true. The whereas resolutions there. And if you could scroll down, Lindsay, so that they can still see the whereas, but also that recommendation there. Thank you. The recommendation is to provide youth and family-driven, culturally responsive training for law enforcement on the long-term impacts that interactions with young people have on them. Ensure that this training also includes strategies for effective interactions with young people, particularly youth of color, young people with special needs, and youth who may be in a mental health crisis. We saw in, I believe it's Waukegan, Illinois, or was this Philadelphia? Because there have been a couple of police shootings over the past couple of weeks. One of them, there was allegedly a man who was having a mental health crisis, and that led to the police shooting him. And I don't think that they were necessarily younger than 21, but it was a young adult. So we definitely need to find a way to help law enforcement be able to deal with those very intense situations where it's possibly a mental health crisis, and how to attempt to prevent, fatal force in those instances. Lindsay, if you could please scroll down to the next page. So this is the final sub goal, I believe, under B. Ensure that young people understand their rights and the process related to school discipline and or contact with law enforcement. The processes may be offered to them by the police. Explain to the child, act out, things can happen. School can recommend that you go to court or work together one-pagers. This is a very, very raw statement, so I'm not going to butcher it any further, but hopefully if you can read through it there, you can kind of get a gist of what that sub-goal was attempting to say. I'm going to let that stay on the screen for a few more seconds for you to try to gain the context of those raw statements, those brainstorming statements there. Okay, Lindsay, thank you. If you could please scroll to the next page. So this is section overarching objective goal C, which is to commit to schools as places of learning that are welcoming to students and families and designed for student success. The first goal under C is to advance and support educational settings as places of learning and safety for young people. That recommendation was to ensure direct and separate funding for counselors, therapists, and others who can support young people in their socio and emotional development, and make funding for police and schools no longer limited to law enforcement and open to these other developmentally appropriate responses. The next goal would be to incentivize the decriminalization of routine youth behaviors, which are disproportionately enforced against youth of color. If you could please scroll down, Lindsay, just a little bit so they can take a glance at these whereas statements. We can see that a lot of policies, school disciplinary policy, disproportionately affect youth of color. Unfortunately, there's a pattern with people of color experiencing levels of disparity across many spectrums of our society. And that is also at the education level and school disciplinary policies as well. So the recommendation for some of these things that have been found to be true is to provide funding incentives for states that decriminalize willful defiance and related statutes, including zero tolerance policies on school grounds. If you could please scroll to the next page, Lindsay. What time is my agenda line up?
Sonji, you have about 12 more minutes.
Okay, great. The third sub-objective under section C is to, sub-goal objective, ensure accountability for schools and their impact on racial and ethnic disparities within the juvenile justice system. Of course, we know that there are so many intersectors that contribute to the disproportionality in the juvenile justice system. It's not just law enforcement, it's not just the judicial system, it's not just juvenile departments. Some of the referrals do happen in schools. And so trying to help the education system to be more accountable for the decision-making that goes into determining what behaviors need to involve the justice system. If you could scroll down just a little bit, Lindsay, so we could see that full recommendation. So the recommendation is to ensure regulation and accountability for districts that have law enforcement in schools, to avoid justice by geography, including financial repercussions for schools that have shown disproportionality in referrals to court, provide support to those schools in the form of assessment, review, and audit of their practices, some type of Department of Education and Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention collaboration for training in response, enhance funding for schools where arrests are not made for school disciplinary infractions and where young people are not handcuffed and or arrested while on school grounds, provide financial incentives for schools that use restorative practices, truth and reconciliation practices instead of arrest and court referrals, more equitable allocation of funding for resources. People are calling for defunding of police and asking to use funds instead of beefing up police departments, use funds to reallocate and have preventative and diversion in place. Preventative programs, most likely, and diversion in place, and rebalance the spending of those dollars, not militarizing and using the funds in ways that are productive, relevant to school culture and climate and effective, whereas potentially in this section, it could be said that proven and promising reinvestment targeted back to schools that are most impacted, and restorative policing as a model and training component. If you could please scroll to the next page, Lindsay. So we are on the final objective and sub-goals, which is D, and that is to increase investments in communities of color to support dreams and aspirations of young people and their families. And one thing that needs to happen in order to do that is ensure autonomy for communities most impacted by racial and ethnic disparities in the juvenile justice system, to craft solutions based on strengths and needs of their individual communities. And one recommendation is to provide increased investment in Title V of the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act to ensure youth promise committees are able to hold local planning sessions to assess what is needed in the local community and how to address those needs to better support young people of color and their families, and to ensure that these funds can be used for mental health services and diversion at the point of and or prior to arrest, including civil citations, family resource centers, healing programs, mobile crisis units, and truth and reconciliation practices. The next goal is to ensure that service and program providers are culturally competent. We know that sometimes it's hard for someone to have to continually explain something to get a service provider or a treater to understand where you're coming from. And if they're already culturally competent or have similar lived experiences, that makes it a lot easier for the person receiving the service to connect with that provider. And one recommendation is to require federal fund grant programs to be reevaluated to include both qualitative and quantitative data matrices in determining whether a program is successful, and programs must be held accountable when outcomes show racial bias exists in their outcomes, and ensure that funding is available for small community-based providers that are culturally competent and high quality, but may not be able to meet the evidence-based quote unquote threshold. I think we're on the last page here. If you could scroll on down there, Lindsay, I can inhale and exhale, take a breath. I think we may have missed one on the previous page, did we? Number 3, ensure all students within the given school districts have equal access to programs and opportunities. Provide financial penalties for school districts where data show advanced placement, and a lot of the more lucrative opportunities are not equally and equitably available in schools where there are Black and brown students. You can go to the next page, Lindsay, please. This is the final page. Commit to supporting youth of color and their families as they seek to heal from current traumas. And the recommendation is to ensure that federal funding can be used for culturally competent mental health services, including those that may not be quote unquote evidence-based, and possibly provide grant funding to be established to provide services outside of the youth justice and child welfare systems. The 5th sub-goal for D is to commit to supporting youth of color and their families as they seek to heal from historical traumas and ensure that Title II dollars, which is the money that encompasses the Racial and Ethnic Disparities Fund of this JJDPA, can be used for a broad range of programs focused on addressing racism and racial and ethnic disparities within the justice system, including but not limited to bringing together communities to conduct conversations for focused on healing harms of historical injustices. And if you could please scroll down a little bit, Lindsay. Ensure accountability for those charged with caring for our young people. Qualifications for foster parents should be revised to prohibit their advocating for arrest in cases where a young person is being considered for diversion. Financial penalties should be levied against group homes that disproportionately call law enforcement on Black and brown youth in their care. So we made it to the end. Thank you all for allowing me to read to you. Because it was such a raw in-process document, we didn't want to send it out to you all as is, and just wanted to begin the conversation to give you all an idea of the work that is in progress, and as it's fine-tuned again and closer to a final version, we will make sure that you get a copy of that so that you can make the decision if this is something that the Youth Development Council wants to support. So let's, how much time do we have left?
So 3 minutes. Actually, amazing work, Sonji. Thank you so much. So I'm going to just open up if there's a great in the chat box. If there's any committee member who would like to or ask a question, please pop it in there. And while we do that, Sonji, I want to make sure I understand the process. That the Coalition for Juvenile Justice is a national nonprofit made up of all of the states, and it really advises some of the federal agencies. And this paper can be truly a statement from the CJJ as kind of our priorities as across the country, and the OJDDP and OJDDPA are ones that have asked for advice and for input from the Coalition of Juvenile Justice in the past. So as this moves forward, there'll be a meeting at the end of the month where we'll be asked to vote on this. And so my second request from the chat room or chat column is if there's any concerns, of course I want to vote for it. So I want to make sure that there's anything that we want to really make sure from Oregon we want to see in it.
And I appreciate the kind sentiment and the statements that have been made in the comments. Definitely, Tabiti, I see that talk about how of the recommendations. Definitely, I think coming up with these statements and these things that we want to do and the intent is not the hard part. The execution is always the difficult part, because we've known a lot of this stuff for decades, if not, well, I guess I'll say decades. I was going to say if not centuries, but maybe centuries might be pushing it. But figuring out how to make it consistent action and embed it into something that is lasting and a part of a new way, a new order of how we function in our society is the more difficult part. So definitely, this is going to take a lot of work, but I'm on board and I'm ready to do what needs to be done to try to carry out some of these in Oregon. And it seems like you all are leaning towards a yay. I have a question about whether cultural competence includes linguistically responsive. I would believe so. I don't know what I was watching. Oh, it was a video in one of our DEI conference training sessions last week, in where it was shown that someone approached a young man who was likely very intelligent and doing his job and not harming anyone. But because he spoke more hood and, you know, said yo or hey or what's up or y'all or whatever the case may be, his coworker in the skit approached him about, you know, maybe fine-tuning the way that he speaks a little bit better. And he asked the person, am I offending anyone with anything that I'm saying, or is it harming anyone? And the answer was no. And he basically said, that's your problem. This is my summary, not mine. And I'm not going to stop speaking this way if it's not harmful or offensive or violating any rules. So definitely, I think that making sure that sometimes understanding the language of certain groups is very, very important. And I will make sure to bring that up to the group.
Thank you. And I think, you know, TBD, the whole notion of the how, I think becomes some of the work. And I think definitely Sonji can talk more in meetings, next steps, that not only has this committee taken this on, but there's a committee between Oregon Youth Authority, Youth Development Council, Youth Development Division, and the Oregon Juvenile Directors Association. And truly, I think the how shouldn't just be in that committee, but we need to ask the how in every committee that we're at once the recommendations are accepted. Thank you, Brian. I also think hopefully Sonji's able to see the comment in the chat around making sure that we don't leave anybody out when we use the youth of color, Black and brown, etc., the tribal youth. And so we need to make sure that we are as inclusive as possible. And I know that cannot just be an Oregon piece, that has to be a national piece as well. So I think that would be great additions if we can, Sonji.
And you know, ironically, this was a very, you know, intense, not necessarily in a bad way, part of the conversation, because the language BIPOC was used in that document originally. And someone who identifies as white was offended by BIPOC, not very much that what Black, Indigenous, people of color stood for, but saying that seeing another acronym could possibly ignite negative feelings. And you know, and I was speaking to someone this weekend who is a person of color, because I hadn't heard of the acronym BIPOC until I came to Oregon. So I thought it was a Pacific Northwest thing, but I learned in the CJJ-RED call that, you know, it's used in certain groups across the country. And so really quickly, I will just say that it's hard to determine what people want to be addressed as, because a Black person told me this weekend, I don't like being clumped into a group that's considered BIPOC, because that means you're putting us all, homogenizing us into one category, and each of our experiences is different. And so then you're potentially leaving out the Hispanic or Latinx community, the Asian community, the Hawaiian Pacific Islander community, when you're clumping them into people of color. So coming up with how to address Black and brown Native American people is something that the conversation will continue to happen, and really working with the groups that are represented in this class of people to see how they want to be addressed, because I've heard some Latin and Hispanic people say that they don't like Latinx. So it's just like coming to a way to make sure that the most representative that kind of works for as many people as possible, because you're always going to have the instance where you may offend someone. And one thing I will say really quickly is I try not to say red when I address racial and ethnic disparities, because the connotation of discrimination and the stereotype that some of our Native American and tribal brothers and sisters have been stereotyped with that label, and they don't like it. Some of them don't. And so when I address racial and ethnic disparities, and I hope that you all will join me, and this is something that is on my list of things to do, that we come to a YDD-wide and YDC-wide consensus of how to even say racial and ethnic disparities. But please, let's try to minimize saying red as much as possible, because that falls into the same conversation. I'm over my time. I was doing good. Y'all got me started again. So thank you all. I appreciate
Thank you, Sonja. Thank you, Sonja. I think I took a couple of your minutes. So you were good. So Sonja, you're right on, you're fine. Next, and great conversation. I think this is amazing. And thank you for your using the chat box. That's great. And when the final document is done, I look forward to seeing it. Ryan, another very important topic. Ryan, compliance monitoring update.
Yeah, so can everybody see my screen okay? Should see
It's awfully little.
Okay, well, this is just the landing page. I will explain what this is momentarily. So just really quick, just to give, I'm sure half the room probably already knows this, but just to kind of give an overview to the other half who may not. We're a participating state in the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. That's part of why we're all here. There's about 32 requirements that have to be met within this act, 4 of which are considered core requirements. Sanji handles one of those 4 core requirements with the racial ethnic disparities. I handle the other 3 with jail removal, separation of juveniles from adults, and deinstitutionalization of status offenders. So with that said, just so we kind of preface that, we're in the first year now that it's officially passed, where the new Jjdp Act has been in effect. We're also entering a new 3-year planning cycle and have the opportunity to make some adjustments to our compliance plan if needed. And typically, adjustments to a compliance plan would be made if there was a requirement for it at the end of a 3-year period, if there was legislation that passed that impacted the compliance policies or how that work is done, or if the act itself is reauthorized, for example. So that's kind of where we're at today, is sort of all 3 are happening. So we have some changes in the Jjdp Act that we have to acknowledge and meet. And then we have SB 15, which was passed, and we're developing some rules to try to streamline this process. And so I'm kind of give you an introduction to it now. I have about, we'll say about 25 minutes to cover the next 2 agenda topics, but I'll try to finish them a little bit sooner. So that way if folks have questions, they can just ask at the end. So what you're looking at here is called the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act Compliance Assessment Tool. It's kind of a mouthful, but essentially what this is this is a part of our grant managing system that we have through SurveyMonkey Apply that we use for applicants to come in and apply for grant funds. We've also taken this system and turned it into a compliance certification program. So what this effectively does is I could hand this link to any agency that happens to operate a facility, and it might be used for lawful custody for some reason or another. And they want to know if any of their facilities that they oversee meet the criteria for having to comply or for having a youth's rights implicated while in there and detained. So they could complete this assessment and be notified through the system based on a series of federal questions that are asked, whether or not they actually meet that criteria. And the system is sending out automated messages. And what effectively here happens is, let's say, okay, the compliance monitoring plan that we submit to OJJDP that we're talking about here has to meet a few elements. It has to be effective, and it has to be able to be effective in identifying facilities, classifying facilities, inspecting facilities, and collecting data from facilities. And this is with secure facilities. So this assessment tool, one of the first things it's going to do is determine whether or not any facilities that you operate are secure. And that's the first litmus for determining whether or not that facility would have to comply with any of the requirements. From there, it goes through a series of questions that even determines the classification type. And then folks who are taking this can then report potentially on those facility types, and it's only going to be asking the questions relative to the facility being monitored. So let me kind of pop in here and just sort of show you. We have 330 facilities that we monitor. Of those 330 facilities, I think about 200 are secure roughly. So that gives you an idea. So the first thing folks do when they come in here, and I'm sorry if you can't really see this, I'm going to try to honestly kind of get through this pretty quickly just to kind of give you a view of what this looks like. But a lot of this is also going to be discussed in the SB 15 topic next. So yeah, and everybody, if you can please mute the mics, there's a lot of feedback I'm hearing and talking. So, okay. So the first thing is Jjdpa Introduction. That's the first thing that folks would encounter. It talks about what it is, what it does, and you know, the word participating state in that. Then there's the next one, which is a private right of action that lets people know that by accepting the federal funds, when there's a facility that meets the criteria for having to comply and a juvenile's been detained there, either pursuant to court authority or law enforcement authority, that juvenile's rights have been implicated. If the facility didn't follow the requirements, or you know, in complying with the act, it potentially opens them up for litigation in private right of action. The next thing is the designated state agency. That's who we are, the Youth Development Division. The Youth Development Council serves as the state advisory group, and then we're the designated state agency that kind of carries out some of that work. So it just discusses who we are, what we do, and there are recent statutory authority for monitoring that was passed too. So once folks get through that, the point of this survey is that we're supposed to collect data of every juvenile detained in a secure facility that has to comply. But we have to monitor all the facilities to know which ones are secure and which ones are non-secure. Non-secure facilities, a juvenile's rights cannot be implicated there. They don't have to report on juveniles detained, but we have to monitor them through survey and spot checks, which is kind of a type of inspection, just to go in and verify they're not using what's called construction features. And these are holding cells, lockable interview rooms, stationary cuffing apparatuses, things like that. And so what's happening here is we're capturing 100% of the administrative information of everybody, but we're only collecting facility information from those that are secure. I'm just gonna kind of go through this. So I asked for the administrative agency, the sector, the jurisdiction, and I'm just making a kind of a trial run right now. So then we ask for here, we ask for just making stuff up. We ask for a administrative head. This would be the chief, the director, somebody who's, you know, has signing authority, and then the operations head. So this could be a records specialist, could be a accreditation specialist, could be a lieutenant. We just ask for their information and their rank, title, name, and email. And that's so that effectively every single agency that operates a facility, we haven't even gotten to whether it's secure or not yet, we have 2 contacts that they have assigned to interface with our office. We're not just calling the number, asking for a person we can talk to, but we actually have intent here. Mark is complete. These are designed as modules. So really, an agency can come in anytime if they have turnover in staff, if they have a new chief or director, they can just come in and update the contact information with us, so we always have that on file. After we get that information, the next thing we ask is a summary of facilities, and this is the why in the road, the split, so to speak. So summary of facilities, we need to know if there's an agency that has facilities that may be used for lawful custody, how many of those are, Not really necessarily what it's used for yet. We just know that if it's just used for lawful custody, anybody can be detained there, juvenile or not. It may meet the definition of facility. So we want to know how many of those are. And let's just use law enforcement, for example. So, John, if I may, the Kaiser City Police Department has one facility that we monitor. The next question is, of those total facilities that are administered by the agency, how many are secure? You can see here there's definitions that are provided with the references. They kind of describe what these are. So, we're asking here, secure means the use of construction features. Like I said earlier, a cell, locking room, stationary cuffing apparatus, things like that. And so we'd say how many of those facilities that you administer, how many of those are secure? And so we say one. And then down here we get to this is just a general question that I'm asking. What's the age range and jurisdiction type of juveniles who you may encounter or individuals? So we have 25 plus, 18 to 24, and 17 and under. And so most law enforcement are selecting all of them because there's not really a restriction on the number of or the age or jurisdiction of kids that they might encounter. They might conduct an arrest on. So once the system's determined, though, that there is a secure facility, that's when it's going to want to go through to disclosure of facilities. I'd say it probably about a little bit less than half of everybody who takes this, you just witnessed everything that they complete. That is it. They're done. So if you, for example, they say they have no secure facilities, we're maintaining that list of facilities over here that we will spot check and survey once every 2 to 3 years. But that's the maximum extent of their obligation to having to comply. People that indicate they have a secure facility move on to disclose that facility, and then from there go on to report on that facility. All right, I'm going to wrap this up here real quick. So let's just go ahead and finish. Okay, jail. All right, so down here, we're using local facility defining statutes, and that's because we have enough of a handle on all the local statutes and the interpretation of which ones meet the definition of the federal classification. So, for example, there's some that are a direct one-to-one relationship. If it's a secure detention facility or juvenile detention facility, it meets the definition of a secure juvenile detention facility in the federal guidance. That's not so much the case for a lot of our other facilities operated by law enforcement. They're called temporary hold facilities. It's just a temporary hold facility as defined locally would just be a facility under federal if it doesn't have any secure features. And if it does have secure features, would then be classified most likely as an adult jail or lockup. So we ask folks if they know their local facility defining statute to select it. So it gives us the indication of what that facility is. If they don't know, they can select other secure holding. That will send them through a different portion of this where I basically classify the facility pursuant to federal guidance and questions. So after they select their facility type, actually I'm gonna check this one here. Okay. Then they can answer a question relative to whether it's residential or not, okay? That's important because the deinstitutionalization of status offenders requirement can only apply in facilities that are residential. So we have to, there are certain questions we have to have the answers to, and we're trying the best to keep it limited to only that. After that, you say, no, I have no more secure facilities to disclose, but you could disclose up to 15 if you wanted to. So that's it, that's done. And then from here, it pops up, this would be a way for you to indicate the months that you are giving a general summarized, we ask for a numerical number to indicate the total number of juveniles detained within each period. And if there is data that's sensitive that needs to be evaluated, we have a secure transfer portal that can be used to submit that information to us. But this effectively allows us to take everybody who submitted an assessment, move all the non-secure ones off to the side and monitor those through spot check and survey, and then take everyone else who is secure and really kind of just go through and making sure that we're really representing this effective system of monitoring, and it's tying all these different requirements together. So that is that. I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap up on this piece unless there's any other questions relative to this. And it'll make more sense when we're talking about SB 15 here in a minute. Some of this will come into play. I can't see anybody right now. For some reason, I lost the ability to see everybody.
Any questions for Ryan? And the best place again is to put them in the chat box so we can make sure we catch them. Okay, I think keep going, Ryan.
Okay, so all right, guys, I want to go over to SB 15. Lindsay, I'm going to hand back control to you if I can here, and then have you pull up the SB 15 rules document. Okay, so I've got about a little less than 10 minutes on this. All right, so I believe it was early 2019 that we got SB 15 passed that gave us legislative authority to monitor. And what SB 15 actually said when it passed was that the YDC, the Youth Development Council, has the authority to inspect and collect data on facilities as defined by rule in which juveniles are detained. So it's pretty narrow, it's pretty specific, pretty short to the point. So what we wanted to do was, there's a couple different things. And Cord, you know, please jump in at any time if there's anything you'd like to contribute. There's going to be a short period of time I have on this. Okay. We have to develop rules for this SB 15, but in the course of developing the rules, there have been some stakeholder groups that we've had, stakeholder meetings. Not everybody in this group has necessarily been a part of those, but in those meetings, mainly Cord sought to get feedback from stakeholders who would be impacted by SB 15 to find out more or less about what it is that they would like to see out of it, if there are any necessary changes to compliance required, things of that nature. So as we started to kind of have these meetings and get feedback from folks, it started to become very apparent that what we needed to do was provide more specifics, more clarity to people. That's what they were asking for. And so rather than do that necessarily in rule, we decided to do that in guidance instead. So we are in the process of developing 3 guidance manuals, one for adult jails and lockups, one for secure detention and correctional facilities, and one for what's called other secure institutions that would be for court holding facilities and Department of Corrections. And these 3 manuals will provide the specific information for how exactly we are carrying out compliance, how exactly each facility can comply. We'll be able to put graphs, matrices, other such tables in there to help inform people about what those requirements are. But in the rules here, what we really want to get to is straight to the point of what we absolutely need to have in language in order to meet our standard for having adequate monitoring authority and an effective system of monitoring. Those are 2 things that we have to meet to be in compliance with the Jjdpa. So here in the first portion of the rules, I don't know how many of you had a chance to look over it over the weekend, but you'll see there's an extensive list of definitions. Not all of these are federal definitions. We have, I think, only about 5 of them were derived directly from the Act itself verbatim. The rest of them are essentially procedures that have been turned into definition, and that is, like, for example, spot check, or compliance plan. You know, these are just different definitions. What we wanted to do is kind of expound on some methods and procedures and ways that we've historically done compliance, to try to make it real clear. I'll try to go through this here down below. Let's see. Okay. So going through to the definitions, let's get right down to maintaining compliance, page 6, with custody and facility provisions of the Jjdp Act. So item 1 basically borrowed directly from the statute, which says to perform its duties as required, the YDD may collect data and inspect any facility as defined in rule in which juveniles are detained. Okay, that's what the statute says. Number 2 says places established as facilities by the YDC under the definitions in OAR shall be surveyed either online or in person by the YDD. Now, I'm sorry for going all over the place here a little bit. If you go up to the definitions under item 14, that is where definition of facility lies. And if you look there, you can see facility means an institution, a place, a building, or part thereof, or a set of buildings, or an area, whether or not an enclosing or a building or a set of building. It's very, very broad. Which is used for lawful custody and treatment of juveniles and may be owned either or operated by the public or private. So that's pretty broad and that's pretty vague. Now what that means is there's going to be facilities, for example, temporary hold facilities would meet this definition of facility on its face. Operated by law enforcement, by a public entity, used for the lawful custody of juveniles, right? Whether or not it meets the definition of adult jail or lockup depends on whether or not it has construction features within it, which is what our assessment tool is designed to determine. So going back down here. So the idea here is about once every 2 to 3 years, we would send a survey out through the assessment tool to all of our agencies monitored. They create a profile where they release 2 contacts to us for the purpose of interfacing with our office. They give us the administrative information, total facility sum administered, and then just closing any secure ones if they have those. From there, we have those facilities that are required to report annually doing so, but we can then contact everybody through the system at the end of 2 years or 3 years and say, everybody, please go in, check to make sure the information's still accurate. You know, do you still not have any construction features, things of that nature, and have them run through that assessment and then make a determination from there. If they, for example, halfway through a year decided to install a construction feature, like a cell, or for example, they would become secure and they would have to be monitored as a secure facility. So facilities, so it says here, facilities that do not fall under A through C, institution, secure detention or correctional facility, or adult jail or lockup. These 3 right here represent the total 3 category types that we have to collect data from and inspect on a schedule. If you don't meet the definition of any of these facilities, then you're still secure, like a mental health facility, for example, or maybe a secure substance abuse treatment facility, those might not necessarily meet the definition of a facility that has to comply, but still needs to be surveyed, monitored, you know, spot checked, things of that nature. Going down, how much time do I even have? Let's see.
You're right close. You have about 2 minutes left, Ryan.
2 minutes. All right. Gotta finish it up, man.
Of
Yeah.
what you need from us.
Yeah. Well, here's what I need from you guys. I need you to. I'm so sorry. I'm trying to find the document. We essentially need the Youth Development Council here in time to adopt these rules, because in doing so, by adopting it in at least the definition of facility, if we're defining facility in rule, and if we define facility in accordance with how the feds have defined facility, which is our obligation, then we're meeting the minimum standard requirement for at least having the authority to adequately monitor those facilities that we have to. There's not, just to get to the point, these rules just kind of get us into compliance. If we were to submit these to Jjdp, it would meet the requirements of what we have to do with all these facility types to stay in compliance. There's not any hammer, so to speak, within these built in anyways. It's just what it does is it opens up the authority for Sanji and I to request data from any facility that meets these requirements and for us to make recommendations to those facilities. How to be in compliance, or how to reduce disparities, things of that nature. So it's a lot of information here. I have not adequately covered all of it in the amount of time I've had to go through these 2 topics. If anybody has any questions at all, for the sake of continuing on time, please let me know.
Oh, thank you, Ryan. I just need to kind of help you clarify the answer to Molly's question, and I hope Court will help me here. I believe the rules in its current draft form as well, the rules rule, are ready for review by this group for recommendations, whether the draft looks like acceptable to you. Are there any revisions that the committee would like to propose before the rules go to final vote by the YDC during December meeting? Is that correct, Cord?
Yes, for the most part. So a couple of I guess, the broad strokes of next steps. So we're going to continue working on the rules over the next month through the month of November. We've been trying to figure out the best timeline for publishing the rules, and then once the rules are published, they're open for public comment. So there's ongoing opportunities for input, but we would bring it to the council for a first reading of the draft rules. And right now, it looks like probably the December council meeting is a good time for that to happen. And we believe we can have a suitable draft to publish on December 1. But in terms of for this committee, I mean, part of why we wanted to share it a little bit ahead of this meeting was to give folks a chance to look at it. If you had an opportunity this weekend or today, if you had comments here, we would want to hear them. If you have other comments or questions, we have time to continue to get input from you, and there may be some other work to just try to make sure that we get as much stakeholder feedback as possible before we actually publish them. And again, once they're published, that isn't necessarily the final draft either, but it would go before the council for that first reading.
Okay, so council members or committee members, are there any questions that you would like to ask Cord or Ryan?
Yeah, this is John.
Go ahead, John.
So these look familiar to me, but I've read a lot of stuff over the months. Maybe I've already looked at these. If not, are we going to run these past the juvenile directors, the sheriffs, and I guess some of the chiefs too also have temp holding facilities and even jails, although not for juveniles. We're going to run this past those associations before we even push out the temp rules. Might be good to have those informal conversations ahead of time.
Yeah, no, good advice, John. Thank you. That's not just a conversation for me or question for me. I think that's a little bit of a group effort between Cord, Anya, and I to determine when and where appropriate that might be to pull those groups together to solicit some of their feedback on this. We haven't done it yet, though, John.
Cord may want to weigh in. So the Oregon Juvenile Directors Association and OYA, Oregon Youth Authority, have participated in a couple of calls with Cord and Kirk with in regards to Senate Bill 15, but I'm not sure on the other organizations, and Cord may have more information.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I mean, I think that makes sense. I'll talk with Brian about that, but I think that ongoing stakeholder feedback is a pretty good move.
Yeah, I just, I mean, if you gave it to the chief, I'd be one of the few that is tasked with looking at it. And I would just say, hey, get it back to us in 2 weeks, and I wouldn't give them any much more time than that. Yeah.
I just want to say, John, just because you know this process pretty well, it's a lot of words down below in this document, but it changes nothing about how we have done compliance. It's putting just terms behind everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we sold this to the chiefs and sheriffs back previously, so it's just a matter of making sure that the definitions we're proposing are what's reflected in real life. That's primarily what I'm talking about.
Absolutely. Okay.
Easier for us to accommodate their terms than for them to change their terms among 200 plus agencies to accommodate ours. But
Law enforcement are the biggest group that we work with. So.
Yeah.
And truly, John, you're one of the experts when I would turn to it, because you've even trained on this at the national level. So I appreciate your comments and feedback. Any other questions? I did get the opportunity to have a question in the chat. And if it's okay, I'll go ahead and ask that question. Is really looking at Senate Bill 15, have we looked at it through the equity lens and used the equity lens to read through it and kind of make sure that we're staying true to what our statements are?
So this is, do the best I can to explain this really quickly. So there has been some work to some level being done on trying to develop rules around SB 15 for some time. So these rules basically are our latest attempt to synthesize the requirements by OJJDP and just put to language what we need to have in order to meet the minimum thresholds for an effective system of monitoring and for adequate authority. That said, though, there is ample room for more contributions in the interim, I think, towards looking at that as more of, from an equity lens, because, you know, I would say Sanji has, who is our racial ethnic disparity coordinator, if this passes, would have the same monitoring authority that I do, and there would be no difference between the two of us in terms of collecting data, analyzing it, making recommendations to facilities. But there's still, if that answers your question, but there's still more room. We could do more of that in.
Okay.
Yeah, and I just to add to I mean, I think what Ryan said really hits it in terms of my own answer to that question. I felt like particularly like codifying how the racial and ethnic disparities work happens is really advances our equity work, you know, as an agency, and I believe for the council as well. But by just making it clear that that is something that we now have a process around, and really elevating it as a priority of the work. But I think that there probably a lot of this is essentially us just referring back to the federal language and trying to reflect the federal guidelines as you know, accurately as possible. But I think maybe within guidance, which I know, you know, part of the work that Ryan is still doing is creating really clear and effective guidance where we have a little bit more of an ability to make those kinds of adjustments. That might be a place where we could go deeper on that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ryan. And again, thank you for bringing it forward. Thanks for all of the work that you guys have been doing on Senate Bill 15, which kind of segues us into, you had mentioned kind of the 3-year plan, and a couple of other things all coming together at the same time. So Anya, I'm going to turn it over to you to start down the conversation around our plan for the next the 3-year plan.
Thank you, Molly. You may have noticed that Sanji and Ryan share enthusiasm for their work, and our compliance with the Act would not be possible if it weren't for the amazing work these two individuals do. Because both racial and ethnic disparities work, compliance monitoring work are fundamental for the state of Oregon to receive Title II funds. Without those two components in place, we would not be eligible for any funding. But now that presumably we are eligible, at least currently we are in full compliance with the Act, we are eligible for the full amount of funding, whatever that might be, based on congressional appropriation. Every 3 years, we go through a new cycle. It's like renewal cycle when we have an opportunity to revisit our current priorities and identify the next priorities for the next funding cycle. I like this little chart that Lindsay has shared with you. I will not claim ownership because that would be outright wrong. I had absolutely no input in creating this fabulous little picture, but I think it's really helpful because it's on one page, and I will just briefly tell you what our future holds for us as far as the Juvenile Justice Committee. And my hope and expectation is that at some point the full membership of the Youth Development Council will be involved, and certainly they will have to accept the 3-year plan as we develop it. Now, our timeline currently stands at the plan needs to be submitted to the Jjdp at the end of March of 2021. However, I'm saying as it currently stands because we do not really know when it's due. We do not know when it's really due until the Jjdp releases the solicitation. That they're in the process of development, but we do not really know when it will be public. The Jjdp training is going to be happening in November, well, later this month. So there is a chance that the solicitation will be ready then, but not 100%. So let's say the latest it will be due is end of March. The earliest it can be due, given past year's precedents, is end of February. So the timeline is pretty short, but it still has to go through those 3 stages here. And the first stage is research and engage. There are 2 things happening here already. So for one thing, we've started communication with NPC Research, and many of you are familiar with their work because they have been evaluating JCP services over the last at least a dozen years, quite a few biennia. And they also did the juvenile crime analysis, which was required under the previous 3-year planning undertaking. So we're working with them to get the newest data analysis possible. So that will be our kind of research foundation for the data analysis. And there are some required elements that are required by the feds, but we're also asking them to look at other areas that might be of interest to us. It's still working. So our timeline on that research or analysis, I'm trying to stay away from word research because it's really they're analyzing existing data. They're not engaging in active research with participants. So that the timeline for that is by the end of December. So after that, we will have the data that we will be able to use for the planning. Now, another component which I need to talk with you about here is we need to solicit input from youth and community. And this is where we need to have a conversation, probably not today, and I know later on the agenda we have an item for the total of 5 minutes is how we organize ourselves between now and the due date for the plan, because obviously we really cannot do it in 1 meeting or 2. So this is an opportunity to engage our youth committee to maybe connect with youth and youth of all kinds of youth and community, youth and maybe in OY custody, maybe youth and on probation with juvenile departments, I don't know. But we do need to get input from kids, from people who are affected by the system. And we also need to gather input from system professionals. So this is an opportunity for communication with the Juvenile Directors Association, with COJAC, with Oregon Youth Authority, with law enforcement, so kind of broader stakeholder community. It really is important. So we need to think about this and how we gather that input and how that input will be used to form our kind of decision making for the planning, right? So that's the steps. This is the phase we're in right now. So the sooner we have a plan, the sooner we can implement it, and the sooner we have some kind of information that will be used later on. Now, phase 2 which I actually think we can do at the same time as phase one, is to review and revisit. There is nothing that prohibits us from revisiting and reviewing our current plan. What have been the priorities for the current plan? So the phase one and phase two can be happening at the same time. As we're gathering input from stakeholders and youth, we can be looking at what is currently funded, what is currently working, and what doesn't need to be continued. And lastly, the phase three is we develop the plan, and the plan is really identification of priorities for funding. There are options. There are 35 areas of programmatic fund areas for funding. So that will be something that we will be able to choose from. It's really a menu of things. Well, unfortunately, you cannot go outside of the 35 areas, but 35 areas are defined fairly broadly. So that's kind of the next step. And pragmatically, finally, once the priorities are identified based on crime analysis, based on input from stakeholders and youth, and with review and revisions to the current plan, then we should be ready to identify the priorities, identify what goals, objectives we'll be aiming to accomplish, and how we will measure performance. And luckily, we have a whole set of performance measures that would come with each of the program areas. So there are some things that already been, if not set for us, but we don't have to start from scratch. But we still do need to do the work. So this is, I said earlier today, we had a little staff meeting that this meeting today seems a bit of like a commencement to me, because yes, there is some work, a lot of work has been accomplished to date, but still we're on a, and this is the beginning of a new process for us as well. So that I think, unless you have questions right now for it, I would move on to the next item, because I think we can, after I finish the second one, and I don't have a picture. Sorry, I really don't have a picture for that one.
So the second one, Julie, we have so Anya, roll right into it. It's more of an ask, isn't that correct?
Right. So the second one is the juvenile crime prevention planning, which is, now we're talking about the general fund that YDD administers, and YDC as a council has a role, because the role of the council, defined as other duties of the council in statute, is to review the juvenile crime prevention local plans that will be developed by 36 counties and 9 federally recognized tribes of Oregon. So the end goal is to review the plans and recommend them. Well, so for the Juvenile Justice Committee, the committee would be reviewing the plans and recommending them for approval by the the Youth Development Council. However, the starting point is to develop guidelines for the planning processes. So traditionally, we've relied on the statute, which has not changed over the years, but the guidelines around the planning have changed. Of course, just as long as they follow the statute, and we do have a set of administrative rules that also set sort of parameters for the planning, but they still leave quite a bit of room for interpretation, if you will. This is an opportunity to propose priorities for planning. This is an opportunity to maybe have a conversation about racial and ethnic disparities reduction. In the past, we've asked people to provide disproportionate minority contact data specific to their community. So this is So this would be the set of criteria that we are able to ask communities to respond. A couple of planning cycles ago, we asked people to adhere to the positive use development practices and concepts. So anyway, so this is something that we can be, I don't want to use the word creative, but this is where we can be in, you know, in alignment with the times we live in. Because when the juvenile crime prevention law was passed, that was 1999, if I'm not mistaken. And Molly and Christina, correct me if I'm wrong, because I know you've been working with that longer than I have. But a lot of things have changed since that time. So we've added certain things, and then we've got the evidence-based programming requirement that's been defined as evidence-based practice for the purposes of Youth Development Council and Youth Development Division. Do we need to revisit that policy that was adopted years ago by Jjdpa? Do we need to uphold the policy? Do we need to make some changes to it? So there's some conversation that needs to happen around the planning guidelines. And since the plans will have to be approved and intergovernmental agreements reached by the end of June 2021, so people can start, you know, you implementing the plans and using the funds as of July 1, 2021, we're also on a fairly tight timeline here. So there. It's almost like what I'm really asking the committee to do is I'm asking committee for help.
Sure. And so so Anya, we had the opportunity to have kind of a brief conversation ahead of time to kind of figure out where the action items are on this agenda. And this is one of the action items, not necessarily for a vote, but a real request to our committee to dedicate some time to work on the guidelines, and knowing that we cannot do it in our meetings, the Juvenile Justice Committee meetings. So I'm asking, as chair, is if we could have a small ad hoc subcommittee that would be really focused on looking at the guidelines and kind of moving forward and bringing something back to the committee for consideration. And I'm also really cognizant of county timelines and wanting to be very thoughtful of county budgets. So Christina McMahon, I was hoping that I could ask you to potentially chair an ad hoc committee because you're part of the juvenile justice piece, and then we could ask for committee members to join from our subcommittee.
Yes, I would be happy to help with this. If you want me to chair it, I'm happy to do that. But I do think it's important to get, I know you want to put together a small group, Molly, but I think it's important to have diversity of perspectives on this, even though, yes, I've been a county juvenile department director in 3 counties, and obviously I've been involved in this. I used to be in the JCPAC, but I really think that there's other perspectives that need to be at the table. So specific, and I have to apologize, I don't know everyone yet. I started right in the middle at the start of the COVID pandemic, so I didn't get to meet all you folks in person. But I do know that the providers who are doing this work, I mean, some counties use their own staff. In the counties I've worked in, we've used community-based providers to provide services, and I think that we need those perspectives at the table. That's really critically important. So yes, I'm happy to help out and do what you need me to do.
Yes, and also Andy Leonard, we'll ask him to join. He has been instrumental with the tribal and the implementation of the JCP planning amongst the tribal entities. And so we'll ask him to also participate. Are there others that would like to join the committee?
This is Andy. How you guys doing?
Oh, you are here, Andy. That's awesome.
Yeah, I had to deliver senior meals earlier, so it took me a long time.
Thank you.
But yeah, that's good. I'll be I'll be on that subcommittee. That sounds good.
And again, I think, Christina, you're right. As the subcommittee does their work, getting subject matter experts and people that are doing the work are critical. But a couple other people might want to join. So maybe this is the way to do it. Please don't anyone block Christina's phone number. So when she calls you,
That's funny.
it does sound like a big lift, but I do think that there's a good foundation to start with. And so it's not like having to completely rewrite. Sam, I think you've participated in the past. Would you potentially be willing to kind of help out?
I'm willing to help out, but I really agree with Christina's wisdom in having other perspectives and then not to have the committee so inundated with government employees, whether it be state or county. That's my feeling. Perhaps more providers and so forth. Yeah, I totally agree with Christine. She has a great point to bring in a more diverse group. But then, if you need me to participate, I'll participate.
Right. I think just the education lens that's something that many of these take.
This, Brian, just,
Yeah.
it does seem like, I don't know, Foy Vu from the YDC, who works at the Asian Family Center connected to ERCO, might be a potential person. And it would seem to me that among Anya and her team, as well as the relationships, right, that other folks, Christina, Molly, etc., we could probably identify a couple of community providers. Maybe, our grant managers could probably do the same, grantees of ours that could potentially be added to the list.
So we will continue recruitment efforts.
Great. That sounds good. It sounds like we have a plan.
Thank you, Molly.
Anya, do you want me to talk about the Yamhill County Extended Detention?
Yes, please do. I have some issues with my sound here. Sorry.
Sure. So at our last full DC meeting, our council meeting, there was a tentative, there was a temporary approval of the Yamhill County Department of Corrections or Department of Juvenile Detention Extended Detention Program with the ask that we would go back and do a site visit. Well, for those of all of us know that we're in COVID time, we actually did a virtual site visit with Yamhill County and it went really well. Other than myself, who else was on the site visit? Anya was there. Anya, do you have a list of the people who participated? It was a good group.
So Sam was there, Ryan, and then Sanjay was there. And of course, I knew you would ask, and of course, I don't have it handy right here. But what did transpire? Oh, Parasa was there. Thank you, Sam. I think, yeah. So please continue. We did ask him for a question, and I'll put you answer to that.
So we had a really good discussion, and Jessica Beach, Dana Carval, and Scott Prosh were all there and presented as well. And we felt like what we had expected to see is what we saw through the conversation with policies and plans and who they're serving. And we had asked them to do some breakdown for us, and they have done that. and it was in your packet. So I would really, I think that at the next Youth Development Council, I mean, I'd be entertaining any questions that our subcommittee might have. We're looking at the data, what the committee might have, if any, that we can say that they met their requirement and that their temporary approval becomes permanent. Oh, we should have got to this before Parasa got off the line, but I'll have to apologize to her. Anybody else have any comments? I know Ryan, you were on the phone, on the call. Sam?
No, I didn't have any comments in particular for me. Some others may have from that day, but not for me to speak to per se.
What Yamhill shared with us is that it's used very rarely, and then that it's really a not highly utilized program, and I think their data shows that. And it really comes from both Yamhill and Polk counties and no other counties outside of the area.
I was debating on if I was going to bring it up or not, but I will go ahead and insert that. If you look at the column of race and ethnicity, you see that the last column is other unknown, and that makes up 15% of their population. And one issue is that they have included other and unknown in the same category. So we don't know how many of those are officially other, which is a category according to the federal guidelines. And then we don't know how many of those are truly, quote unquote, unknown, which is meaning that either the youth didn't self-identify or the decision maker, interviewer, intaker, facility staff wasn't able to identify the youth. And so because it's kind of ambiguous and we don't know how many are other and unknown, I can't be as emotional fully because, 22 of them could be other. And that's legitimate. But let's say 20 of them are quote unquote unknown, which is 15% of their population. They were not able to identify over potentially an extended period of time the race or ethnicity of a youth. And that's a problem if in fact they are quote unquote unknown. And no judgment or pointing a finger at Yamhill, because our state data for some categories of our decision points also show that there are large numbers of truly unknown youth where they're not other, they were not identified to be race or disparity. And my hypothesis is that a lot of those are probably youth of color or Black, potentially mixed, Native American, Latin American youth, because the ambiguity and not being able to identify is the problem. So one thing that I hope that comes out of this and you are able to see is that we need to determine a way to have a standard race and ethnicity identification process amongst in the juvenile justice entity that will take this information. And typically that would be self-identification, and only in certain instances where the youth didn't identify that they would have to default to the decision maker representative to make the decision. And of course, educating on how to make the most objective decision as possible. So I hope that you all see this and know that this also contributes to disparities, because if a lot of those others are truly unknowns and they are truly youth of color, then that means there are potentially more disparities in Yamhill County and across the state. so this is an ongoing conversation, but I just felt like I should go ahead and throw that in there.
Sonji, I think spot on. I'm actually I was just gonna, Christina, I was actually gonna call on you to talk about that because this is a systemic definition. Unmute, Christina.
You're muted, Christina.
Sorry about that. I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing another agency either, but I do know that from my experiences, and I can't speak for Yamhill County, maybe there's somebody who's from Yamhill County on the phone here. A lot of times when kids come into detention, they're lodged, and the information that is put into JJIS, which is where this comes from, is based on what's been noted by the police officer. And we've been talking about in my own department about we need to do a better job of correcting that information or digging deeper into that information when kids come to us and not just taking it just off of what's on a piece of paper. And a lot of times, and I can't speak for other agencies, but I do know with some law enforcement agencies, there's varying degrees of training or even interaction or communication with kids. And sometimes kids don't want to talk to the police officer. They're angry. There's all kinds of dynamics at play. But a lot of times what happens is that incorrect information starts at that point of either arrest and being brought into a facility, or even when the referral is sent in the old-fashioned paper way to the juvenile departments, and it never gets corrected along the way. And so that's a problem where there's a lot of different folks touching that youth and it never gets corrected. So to me, it's more than just an issue of Yamhill County, their juvenile department and how they're doing this. I'm not saying that we all need to do a better job, but it has tentacles with a lot of different agencies that are serving kids, is my point.
I really appreciate that. And being on the JJIS steering committee and looking at JCP data and then looking at the data is where the data is pulled for this particular report. We tend to do a better job in one, but it doesn't self-correct the data in the other. So it really is paying attention,
exactly.
Making sure we correct all data points. And so I really appreciate that, Sonji. I think that's something that we can continue to lift up in the training of JJIS.
Hi, everybody. This is Scott Bosch. If I can just jump in real quick. Detention manager, Yamhill. The information was a little alarming when we pulled it, and some of that, I think, I would agree with what everybody said as well. I think some of it's training. I think some of it's how the information comes in, and I think in some of these cases, it'd be easy just because of the numbers. It'd be easy enough for us to cross check to see maybe if there's better information in our detention admissions than maybe what's already in place in JJIS, like you had mentioned, Christina, like in a referral, that already come through the juvenile department. So, but yeah, that's something that did jump out on the paper because we've only had maybe half a dozen or more folks, and of those reported, seeing that it just jumps out at you. But I think it probably does happen more often outside of the extended detention piece. So. Again, I'm with you guys. I think it's kind of a training issue, not just in detention, figuring out how we can, without stepping on toes, because we contract with other counties, get in there and change demographic type information. It's probably just coordinating that with Rich and his folks at Polk to see if that's an option or how they'd like us to do that. But yeah, I appreciate all the information. And Sonji, you're absolutely right. Based on the number of kids that showed up in that report, that is a large percentage that was unidentified. So I appreciate that.
Yes, absolutely. And hopefully as a part of my job and working with everyone collaboratively, we can get to the point where there's a statewide standard process to collect that data, and only the rule will be accurately collecting racial and ethnicity data to the best ability, and only few exceptions where there's some ambiguity there, or just rare instances where it truly is an unknown. So I appreciate, the response that you had. And again, it's not to ridicule or criticize or point a finger. I just know that potentially is an issue that needs to be addressed, especially with disparities.
So since
No, thank you.
can I ask, maybe it's a dumb question, but since disproportionality exists within a larger context of total population, I don't remember, and I couldn't bring up the full form from what got sent to me, but does this contain information about county metrics generally, so we know how to look at this subset against, I mean, let's say if they're 80%, how the percentages break down for the general population, not just the population that is either that is in detention?
Judge Abernathy, great question. And typically, I think this, if I'm not mistaken, this piece of information, this report was put together specifically to address the question that we had in our virtual extended detention assessment. But generally, each year, Jjdpa produces a racial and ethnic disparities report that will show how many white, African American, Asian, Hispanic, Native American youth are in each county, and then also the decision points that we typically analyze, which one of them is pretrial detention, which would include the juvenile detention centers. It would show the percentage of the race and ethnicity within that entity or that decision. So the Jjdpa's report would compare and contrast the admission population versus the percentage in that county. But I believe this was a specific report that was generated to respond to a wide DC inquiry.
Yeah, I am aware of that other report. I guess to me, anytime we look at this, any subset of this data, it ought to be against the larger context. But maybe it wasn't, as you say, because it was specifically asked by us. But I just think, as a general rule, we should be always looking at this data within that larger context, because otherwise you don't really get a sense. You could get a more positive sense that we're not disproportionate when we actually are.
Right, absolutely. Anytime that I am analyzing race and ethnicity data for the decision points that the Act requires, it's always looking at the percentage of the youth in that population, because of course, as you're stating, you don't know if there's a disparity if you don't know how many youth are generally in the population. For instance, statewide, African American youth make up probably about 2 to 3% of the population, but for referrals, they are referred at a rate of about 5%. So you can clearly see that there is a disparity that exists there, and it's also almost 3 times, if not above 3 times, that of their white counterpart. So yes, when we're analyzing specifically for race and ethnicity, we are looking at the overall population, but I think this was a isolated report.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Okay, and I really appreciate you raising that question, and the question to Sam. I think that the policy for Jjdpa is specific that we're supposed to ask youth to self-identify. And so I can appreciate the piece of crosswalking it with ODE. And that may be something we need to do in the future. And both Christina and I sit on the steering committee at least to ask it. But the policy really has been around Jjdpa and juvenile justice is we have the capacity to ask youth to actually assist them in self-identifying. There's just some limitations, and we know it in the Jjdpa reporting fields. And so we're working on it. It's definitely something that we're interested in and caring about. We're just not quite there yet. So any other questions? And Scott, thank you so much for being on the phone.
No, thank you guys very much. I appreciate it.
The only part we really did miss coming to the facility and kind of walking through and meeting everybody in person, but in the world of COVID, and we certainly appreciated the time that everyone took to spend it with us. Anya, I'm going to ask for some questions. I'm going to ask us to deviate on the agenda and talk about the committee meeting schedule, and then I'm going to ask to move everything to the next meeting. We have a lot of work to do, and we're coming into a new biennium. And so as the chair of the Juvenile Justice Committee, I would like to ask if this group would be willing to go back to monthly meetings for the next few months, because we have a lot to get done. And today we would have liked to have dove into the conversations, and I felt really bad about having to kind of rush us through, because I think the beauty of committees are the fact that we get to talk to each other, and it doesn't feel like that. So I'm asking if everyone would be willing to save this slot for the next, at least until the end of spring. And we have the 3-year plan done. We have the crime prevention planning done to meet the first day of the month from 1 to 3. So
which day of the month, 1 to 3?
Oh, the first Monday is what we've set aside for this particular meeting. And we used to meet monthly, and then we kind of got caught up, and now we're kind of behind again. And so it would be at least through April. And so our next meeting would be December 7th, and the meeting after that would be January 4th. And Anya, do you want to take anything?
And will this be for the next 4 or 5 months, you're saying?
It will be through April. So I guess that's
okay.
With it. So Anya, will send out a notice or what?
Huh?
Anya will send out a notice or what?
Yes. We'll schedule meetings. We'll have a link to meetings attached. I really appreciate it.
Yes, so we'll send out notice to people, just like every other time. Prepared. December, January, and then February 1st. And then I don't have a new calendar for March, but the first Monday in March and then the first Monday in April, and then we can reevaluate. Okay, perfect. Well, Pamela, luckily maybe some of them will be recorded, or we can at least send out information ahead of time, and you're great at reviewing stuff ahead of time and can send comments in. That would be awesome. Thank you, Tabidi. Okay. Anything else we need to get done today, Anya?
I'm getting a lot of static, and I don't know if it's on my end or somebody's, but I apologize. And Abe, I'm so sorry we never got to you.
I was gonna say, if you want, I can send something out through email, and then you can just distribute it to everyone else if that's helpful.
If that works for you.
Yeah, that's fine.
That would be great, and we'll make sure that we put Abraham at the top of the list next meeting.
Thank you.
That's how it's gonna be. People don't get the time to speak; they get to the top of the list for the next meeting.
That's fine by me.
I just want to be really respectful of people's time.
No, I understand completely. I got to jump on another meeting in a little bit too.
Okay. Okay. Anya, you can have the last word.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't have any last words other than I really, really appreciate your participation over the years and your willingness to meet with us every month. And all the hard work that was put together by YDG staff. And I don't know, Brian, maybe you would like to say the last word. This is your first meeting of the Juvenile Justice Committee that you attended.
I'll just say thanks. It was a good, productive meeting. Appreciate folks putting in some extra time on monthly meetings and also on that subcommittee. So let's keep working.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Anya. Thank you, Sonji. Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks, staff.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.